Welcome to Tech Blueprint, a window that lets you know the latest technology news in the world. Everyone is undoubtedly familiar with the US Entity List. To strengthen its weight and close perceived loopholes in its restrictions, the US has periodically added new Chinese companies to the list, citing national security as a pretext. But this time, they dropped the ball, offering no justification, and the announced ban was unprecedented. Overnight, thousands of Chinese companies were affected by the new US regulations. China's response followed closely, striking directly at the US's weakest points. On September 29, local time, the US Department of Commerce officially announced new export control regulations. According to the information released by the US Department of Commerce, they will further upgrade the regulations for companies already on the US Entity List. The key point is that any subsidiary of a company on the US blacklist in which they hold a stake of more than 50% will also be subject to US blacklist controls. In addition, even for subsidiaries of a few blacklisted companies that do not hold a significant stake, they will also face heightened cargo transportation inspection requirements. According to a Bloomberg report that same day, while the US Department of Commerce's move didn't specifically target China, it was nonetheless intended to prevent Chinese companies from obtaining restricted US goods through their subsidiaries. The UK's Financial Times also commented on the new US regulations, stating that they clearly aim to expand the trade blacklist. In fact, these media outlets' views are quite correct. According to a preliminary analysis by Wirescreen, the new US regulations will affect thousands of Chinese state-owned enterprises and their subsidiaries. In fact, even without data, China can clearly see that the new US regulations are significantly related to Chinese companies. After all, the US has been doing this for years, blacklisting one Chinese company after another under various unfounded pretexts. Not only does it aim to curb Chinese companies' development in semiconductors, but it also aims to suppress them in advanced artificial intelligence technology. They fear that Chinese companies, in an era of rising power, will ultimately completely overwhelm them, so they are desperately suppressing them. Even if one understands the US's motivations, the new regulations still strike one as quite strange. Although these regulations are intended to address loopholes in the US's crackdown, the time between their discussion and finalization was incredibly short. Rumors suggest they only proposed this method a month ago to close loopholes in US export controls. Given the speed with which the US has previously implemented bans, the new regulations wouldn't have been implemented so quickly. Furthermore, whenever the US implemented so-called bans, companies in the supply chain would have received some level of information, and even the US media would have reported on them in advance, deliberately leaked by US officials. But this time, there was no information regarding the ban, and the US move came as a complete surprise. So why did the US impose the ban so suddenly? Was it really just to close loopholes in the previous regulations, as they claim? To understand the White House's true motives, we can start by looking at Russian companies that have been severely impacted by the new regulations. Recently, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine has been intensifying. Faced with this situation, Trump adopted a rare and unusual stance, seemingly intending to directly involve the EU and NATO. At the same time, they were actively lobbying various countries, including major buyer China, to impose restrictions on their purchases of Russian energy. It was clear that the US was serious about implementing more severe sanctions against Russia, hence its reckless and intensified use of the trade blacklist at this time. But China wasn't so easy to deal with. How could it sit idly by when such unreasonable pressure was being unreasonably applied? So, on the very day the US Department of Commerce officially announced the regulations, a Chinese spokesperson also spoke out. First, they accused the US of a scathing offense they could never remove. This unassuming US move is an abuse of export controls and a serious undermining of the international economic and trade order. This undoubtedly served as a global signal that the US's hegemonic behavior is extremely egregious and has crossed the red line of international trade. If China tolerates such actions, the US will only escalate its pressure. At the same time, having tasted the sweetness of US hegemony, other countries in the world may find it difficult to escape US hegemony. Thus, this serves as a reminder to the world's nations to stand up and oppose the US's current actions. Of course, the international situation is complex, and China is unlikely to succeed solely on its own. If it wants the US to change its erroneous practices, China must take action on its own. So, immediately after urging the US to correct its erroneous practices, the Chinese spokesperson stated, "Faced with the impact on the legitimate rights and interests of businesses, and the international economic and trade order, and the stability of global supply chains, China demands that the US cease its unwarranted suppression of Chinese companies. Otherwise, China will take measures. Don't assume this is just lip service. If they truly dare to ban China, China will retaliate. Don't forget that during this phase of the US-China tariff and trade war, China's countermeasures have been swift, accurate, and ruthless. Rare earth controls have left the United States grappling with issues. American chip companies and Boeing aircraft orders have also left the US helpless. Even in the most basic agricultural sector, American soybean farmers are still protesting the White House's trade bans. In the words of the US Secretary of Commerce, they believe China relies heavily on them, and they can leverage this dependence to impose restrictions on China. But China also has many ways to restrict them. If they dare to take unjustified action against Chinese companies, they should be prepared for retaliation. China will not be a troublemaker, and the US should not assume that others will become such because of its past pressure. Doing so will only make them appear increasingly guilty and panicked, and will also lose international trust. Once again, collaborating to promote Chinese companies is the most pressing issue for both China and the US. Continuously expanding the scope of restrictions will only lead to a stalemate in bilateral relations, and American companies will also suffer from their tactics. Do you think there are other reasons behind the US's sudden ban? Feel free to leave comments, like, and share.